Then we're going to be in Acts chapter into chapter 15 and then into chapter 6. Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll go and get started. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. I thank you for the opportunities that you've given us in this life and to come together and encourage each other, and pray that you would help us to think about things according to your church, and that we would have a better insight into all that you've done in providentially bringing about the work that was done, that has allowed us to see your church for what it was intended to be, see its growth and be encouraged by it and learn from it. Pray all these things, Father, in your Son's name. Amen. All right. So I wasn't going to talk a lot about this. I might just make an observation at the beginning of this. They're about to start at the end of chapter 15, and they're about to go out on their second journey. It's Paul and Barnabas, and Paul makes a suggestion that they go back and see the other churches that they have visited before. And what ends up being the sticking point between the two here? Yeah, John Mark. What's the problem? Why not? What's the issue? Yeah, we left earlier. Yeah, we're not told why. We can assume things just got tough, and he either couldn't take it or didn't want to, or whatever it might be. But clearly, it was a situation that Paul looked at this and said, "I can't depend on him. I want people here that are gonna stay the distance." Uh, it's one of those things we're just not told a lot. What we are told about is that there was a pretty strong contention between them, and I think the point that I've heard made a lot here, and I think it's a good one to observe, is that when we think about, well, who's in the wrong here and who's in the right here? I mean, would you say there's a right or a wrong in this? Yeah, I don't know that there is. Partly because we don't know what John did, and partly because we don't know why Paul, there may have been some very specific reasons why Paul felt like, I need this person. I have to be able to count on him. On the other hand, is it wrong for Barnabas to say, look, he was young, he made a mistake. He told me he'll do better this time. He says he's going to do it. Uh, Now, should we have faith in our brethren? Yeah, we should. But we have to be pragmatic about it too, though. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So it's very much in keeping with what we read about Barnabas, that he would want to do this. And I suspect that the fact that he and Barnabas probably had been in association with longer than Paul. Barnabas probably knew him in Jerusalem. I suspect they had a strong bond. He probably viewed him very much like Paul viewed Timothy in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, yeah. Now you got two teams, and Paul goes in one direction, and Barnabas takes John Mark down to Cyprus, and visits those church, and Paul goes with Silas, and rather than having to go down to Cyprus, he goes straight up into Asia, and as a result of that, we've got some pretty important things that happen. Um, because when we talked a little bit about the first trip through and the first journey, and how it's a very good chance that kind of set the stage for Galatia, and the letters to the Galatians and some of those things. Well, when you start looking at the second journey, there's some pretty important things that happen. He starts obviously in Antioch, and they go by land up to Tarsus, which is of course where Saul is from, where he had spent some time working before he came down to Antioch. They're going to work up through Cilicia. They're going to revisit Lystra, Derbe, and then Lystra, up through Iconium and going on up. We'll talk a little bit about this issue here in a little bit. They're going to go through Troas, and as they go through here, one of the first places they're going to go once they get through Troas in Macedonia is Thessalonica. And so now we've got the brethren that he's going to turn around and write First and Thessalonians to. And we'll see this a little bit later on, that there's a lot of things that, we know very little from the book of Acts about the trip, the time that Paul spent in Thessalonica, because he wasn't there very long. But when we read the Thessalonian letters, we'll start to see some things that are going on that'll help us to get a little bit more background. He goes down from Thessalonica down to Berea, And of course, we all know the difference between the Bereans and the Thessalonica. The Thessalonians were, or the Thessalonians, the Bereans were, they were more noble. Now, I will say this, by the way. It says that, if you remember what it says, the Bereans were more noble or more, whatever your translation will say, for they searched the scriptures daily to see that those things were so. How many of them obeyed the gospel? Remember, it says many of them. In other words, not everybody, they didn't still agree, but at least they listened. And at least they were willing to look at the scriptures. Now, not everybody was convinced. And as you remember, the problems really become when the people in Thessalonica up the road here, and so they realized, hey, they're in Berea now. We're gonna go down there and cause trouble there. And so they continue to go. They end up going down by sea, all the way down to Athens, and then to Corinth. So between Thessalonica, I skipped one actually. The first major city he's going to come to, because it's cut off by the map, is Philippi. And so when you think about, to Laura's point, the providence that's going on here, if you remember, they're going along this way, and I think it kind of, you kind of see the road here. Most people believe that what was going on is that they came through Derbe, they came through Lystra up to Iconium. They're like, all right, well, let's just keep going down here, and we'll just go on all the way to Ephesus, because that's where the main road is going to go. And Paul wanted to go to Ephesus, or wanted to go to Asia, but it's around here where the boundary, the border between Galatia and Asia would have been considered, around here. So most people think that what happens, he gets around here, and the Spirit says, no, I don't want you to go there. I want you to go somewhere else. And so they try to go around, and they go all the way up here. And again, they want to go up to Byzantium. I think it's Byzantium. They want to go, no, that's the wrong. Yeah, Bithynia, which is, it's not on this map, but it's kind of up here somewhere. But again, the Spirit says no. And at the same time, remember what Paul sees the vision of the man from Macedonia saying, "Come and help us there." And so, what we learn is that we go over into Troas and we go into Philippi. We go through Thessalonica. Now, somewhere during this, and most people, I believe, think that what happens is when they go to Troas to go into Macedonia. Anybody know who they probably met here in Troas? We don't know this for sure, but yeah, Timothy was before that. Timothy was with them during that time. I think so. Yeah, exactly. It goes from they to we, and so the assumption is Luke doesn't talk about himself, but so all of a sudden, all right, if we go this way, we don't meet Luke. But we go, because of the Spirit's interaction, we go there and we pick up Luke, who, of course, is going to play a huge part in this discussion, not only with the book of Acts, but with the book of Luke itself. And so then we go on up to Philippi, and one of the first things that happened, again, a church, two churches, in fact, Philippi and Thessalonica, that Paul apparently doesn't spend very much time with at all, and yet we have 3 epistles written to them. And as we'll look at, it turns out that the time that Paul spent there, maybe it wasn't the longest amount of time, but it created a lot of very strong followers, strong disciples. And as a result of that, this whole area now all of a sudden is going to have opportunities for the gospel to be preached. And so now he's going to come down. And of course, when they're chased out of Berea, I don't know if that's a typo, or I've never seen it Beroea before, but it may be. But anyway, he comes down. Obviously, this allows him to go to Athens and eventually goes to Corinth. And we know he spends close to 2 years in Corinth. And we get 2 of the most important letters in the New Testament that are written specifically for that purpose. And Paul still gets to go to Ephesus, at least for a little bit, because on the way back, he stops in Ephesus. I think he only stays for 2 or 3 days, if I remember right. But he tells them, "I'm going to be back. I'm gonna come back and see you soon." And of course, on his 3rd journey, that's exactly what he does. And in the meantime, but if you remember who he does meet when he's in Corinth, who else now are we introduced? Do you remember? 2 pretty important people. Yeah, he meets Priscilla and Aquila. So they become so important to him. In fact, if you remember why they bonded together initially? Yeah, they're all tent makers. And so as a result of that, they kind of worked together while Paul had to work until Timothy and Silas. Oh, by the way, I think we've mentioned this. Silas. Anybody know what his Greek name or his Roman name was? It's the name that we would know him by the epistles. His name was Silvanus. If you'll notice, he's the one that wrote most of the letters that Paul wrote. So we don't always think about that or make that connection, but that's almost 99% sure that's who Silvanus is. So now Silvanus is going along with him, and we have Aquila and Priscilla who meet Paul here. And what happens when Paul goes to Ephesus? Well, he can't stay there, but he leaves Aquila and Priscilla there. And so we skipping ahead a little bit. While Paul leaves, he has to go back, and Aquila and Priscilla stay in Ephesus. And you remember who Aquila and Priscilla meet? Apollos. And so Paul's not here, but they are. Apollos meets them. They spend time with him. They encourage him. And so now we've got Apollos who's out preaching in this area, which is why, of course, when it turns out he goes on to Corinth from there, so Corinth gets the additional benefit of having Apollos teaching them. So all this is happening because the Holy Spirit said it's not time for you to go to Asia. And so as a result of that, you can kind of see some of the things that take place as a result of that. So let's look at some more specific things then as we get into chapter 16 and look at some of these discussions. In chapter 16, we are introduced to Timothy. And it kind of, if you remember, chapter 15 in large part was concerned with the idea that the Gentiles and the Jews were having this conflict over circumcision, over the law. And it's interesting how, as Paul and Silas go through this area, they're going to these churches and they're encouraging them, and they're showing them this is what Jerusalem has said. This is the clarification on this, and as a result of that, they're getting a lot of encouragement done. But he stops off in Derbe and he picks up, of all people, a man who is half Jew and half. But it says his father was a Greek. Most likely that what that means is he was a Gentile. It's I want to understand the city of Derbe was never actually a Greek city. So it's most likely that it was someone of Roman descent. And so he just, a lot of times when you see Greek, it just means it just is referring to Gentile. So, yeah, basically not a Jew. So regardless, what a Jew. And so we have this issue of a half Jewish young man who is now going to be, apparently he's been busy because it says Lystra and Iconium, the brethren all knew him and spoke well of him. So he's somebody that in Paul's absence clearly has shown a great deal of zeal for the work. And so Paul wants him to come with him. But before he does that, what does he have to do? He has to be circumcised. And we talked about this a little bit before, the difference between the situation with Timothy and the situation with Titus. But it's a good example, I think. And sometimes I wonder if one of the main reasons that Luke points this out is because there's this continuing ongoing conflict between Paul and the Jews throughout this. And it's going to culminate when he gets back to Jerusalem before his trip to Rome, and they're going to accuse him of speaking against Moses and doing all these things, and they're going to make all these stories about him. And Luke, in the meantime, is showing you a picture of Paul going from city to city and literally doing whatever he has to do to accommodate these consciences. He's going absolutely out of our way to make sure that we don't cause any stumbling, which includes even telling Timothy, look, if you're going to go with me, you need to be circumcised. Because as it says, they all knew that his father was a Greek or his father was a Gentile. And we know that's going to be, we're already having to have a hard enough time getting people to understand this concept. We don't want to aggravate them anymore by adding this to the flame. And plus, of course, when Paul goes into a new town, what's the first thing that he always does? He's going to go into the synagogue and talk to the Jews. And I'm not sure, I wish I'd looked. I'm not sure if the Jews had. I know they didn't have the same stringent requirements for the synagogue than they did for the temple. I'm fairly sure that an uncircumcised Gentile couldn't just wander right on into the synagogue and sit with the Jews. If they won't eat with him, they certainly wouldn't allow him to sit down with him in the synagogue. So I suspect that was one of the things that Paul's saying. If you're going to do this work, you've got to be able to work where we are without causing stumbling. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. it's one of those things where when I can accommodate somebody's conscience and it's not wrong for me to do that, why wouldn't I do that? And so that's that's a pretty strong commitment of Timothy for be willing to do this. Yeah, probably not. Yeah, yeah, that's I think that's right. So, and I think it's interesting that Luke makes the point as after this happens, it says in verse 4, after they've done this, that they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and they increased in numbers daily. One of these days, I think I did this. I don't know if I did this here or not, but I'm going to go back and look at each time that Luke makes a point of pointing out that the church is growing or that the word is increasing. It's invariably, it seems to me, that when the people do things according to the pattern that God has given them, when they do what God has told them to do, the way that God has told them to do it, invariably we read that the churches were strengthened and that their numbers were growing. And so I think that's one of the main themes. You just go through the book of Acts and just mark every time you see that the word of God was growing or the church was growing or multiplying or things like that, because that seems to be what happens. So again, we see down the Macedonian call in verse 6. I always wonder how he knew that it was a man from Macedonia in his dream. I don't know if the Macedonians dressed a specific way or if he just knew. But regardless, the man urged them, come over to Macedonia and help us. And so they go down to Macedonia, and I've got in my Bible the they circled in verse 8, and then in verse 10, the we is circled. And so we see here in Troas again, Luke is most likely joining them here. And so they head into Troas, and it says they came to the city of Philippi. And again, this is, the first place they go ends up being a pretty important stop in this journey, because he's going to develop a relationship with the Philippians that is going to be one of the most important relationships that he has. If you remember, in fact, if you want to let's look over the book of Philippians, if you want to keep your bookmark there and look over at a couple of things to give you an idea of some of the relationships that he forged. uh, for example, Philippians 1, if you go down to verse 12, he says, actually, you know what? Hold off for that for a second. There's three important things, or three major plot points, if you want to say, that take place when he's in Philippi. What's the first thing that we read about when they're in Philippi? Who's the first person we're introduced to? Lydia. Uh, we don't know. There's some people that have actually suggested that her name might not actually be Lydia. Lydia might be a reference to her, to where she's from, which is possible. But regardless, we know she was a seller of purple, which means she was probably relatively successful or relatively well off business person in the area. And they meet her, and it says that the Lord opened her heart to hear the words that Paul was saying. After she was baptized, she urged them, saying, "If you've judged me to be faithful, come to my house and stay." And so we've already got a prominent member of the community now who has joined Paul in the work that they're doing. And so as a result of that, we see the second thing, which we're not told how long it was after this, but probably not that long. They're going to the place of prayer, and what do they encounter on the way? Okay, they got the slave girl with the divinations, the spirit of divination. And I always wonder. I assume that um, it's interesting that Paul seems to have the same kind of attitude that Jesus had towards people who had an unclean spirit. Especially when they're not necessarily hurting anybody, but they're being an annoyance. And finally, it says Paul has just had enough, and he turns around and says, "I command you in the name of the Lord Jesus to come out of her." And we never heard anything more about her, but the story is important because of the people that it offends. Because what happens when Paul casts this spirit out of this woman? What's the reaction of the people who own this girl? Yeah, they're mad. Yeah, that's the whole point of us owning her, is that she can divine spirit, she can do divination, and we can do all that. And so as a result of that, it says that they dragged him into the marketplace before the rulers. And it's interesting to me again. This is a Gentile group, as far as I can tell. It's been Jewish opposition to this point, but this is a Gentile group. It says these men are Jews and are not and they are disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. It's it's interesting to me that the Gentiles are going to make this argument here, and the Jews are going to make that argument later on. It's always that same argument. They'll go to the Romans and try to convince them that these people are teaching something that's contrary to your law. Now, there's a sense in which they're not wrong, because Roman law said you will worship the emperor. The emperor is your God. But, and this is where the irony comes in when you start talking about the Jews, because for the Jews, the Romans made an exception. They were considered an exception class. There's some reasons why that we don't need to get into. I think you could call it providence of God if you want to as well. But the Jews were allowed to continue to do what they did. They were considered exempt from Roman worship, from emperor worship. One of the reasons the Christians weren't persecuted early on was because for a long time the Romans kind of considered Christianity as an offset of Judaism. It was kind of that's the Jews, that's kind of their thing, and they were kind of lumped all together. Well, once the Jews fell out of favor, and once the Romans started to understand a little bit more about Christianity, and probably once the Jews continued to say they're not us, we're not related to them, that special status kind of goes away. And so, when Nero blames the Christians for burning down Rome, then all of a sudden that protection pretty much goes away, and the Roman persecution of Christians really ramps. I've heard a lot of people have made the argument in the book of Acts. If you go through, invariably, when Luke writes these stories, when Paul or any of the apostles or any of the Christians are brought before Roman governments, what typically happens? How do the Romans typically treat them? Yeah, yeah, maybe not. Uh, right. Well, and again, the martyrs to the Romans didn't happen until a little bit later on, too. But you're right. I mean, it's not a universal thing necessarily, but Luke pretty much records an account that depicts the Jews as being the ones that are the instigators. And some people have made the argument that, well, if Luke is writing this to Gentiles, maybe he's trying to paint the Roman Empire in a good light. I think it has more to do with the fact that Roman persecution just hadn't really ramped up that much yet. Even when Paul comes before, appeals to Caesar, they're not sending Paul so that Rome will put a stop to this Christianity thing. They're just, I don't know what else to do with him. He appealed to Caesar, go and send him down there. And of course, when Paul gets there, if you remember, he's put under house arrest. He's there for 2 years. He's seeing people, he's doing whatever he needs to do, and eventually they let him go. So it wasn't a particularly onerous imprisonment on his part. The second one, later on, when that persecution by the Romans did start up, was much worse, and obviously it led to his death. But I think that's one of the reasons why, and you'll see this a little bit in chapter 17 and 18. The Romans tend to either, at worst, they tend to be indifferent towards all of this, and at best, they seem at least to be intent on doing what's lawful, and especially with regard to Paul and his Roman citizenship. When Paul pulls out the citizenship card, well, we can't do anything. We need to treat him with respect. And of course we see this in chapter 16 in Philippi. So as a result of all this, the Gentiles stir up the crowd. They're advocating things that are unlawful, which is not technically true. But the crowd then at that point gets them to be thrown in jail, and that's where we're introduced to the third story of this, which is, of course, the Philippian jailer. One of the great stories of conversion that we find in the book of Acts. And as a result of that, and we also see again Paul's, I guess if you want to call it stubborn spirit. They beat him, they throw him and Silas into jail. They don't leave. In fact, when the jailer frees him, he makes the point after their wounds have been bound and that they've been fed, they go right back into prison. And when the jailer, when the officials come out and find out what's going on, and they find out that Paul's a Roman citizen, what's Paul's response when they say, "Okay, you can go, you can go"? Remember, it says that the jailer tells Paul, "Hey, you're free to go," down in verse 36. And Paul tells him in verse 37, they've beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. Uh, so, Paul is one of those people. I get the impression that he used his Roman citizenship when it was appropriate, and when it was. And there's certain defiance, I think, in this argument that, look, if you put us in here, you come get us out. You can't just pretend that none of this happened. And so you get to Paul, as a result of that, for a change, doesn't have to run from the city. He gets to simply leave on his own terms. It says that he went to the brothers, he encouraged them, and then he departed. Now, having said that, now let's look over at Philippians, because there's some things I think that are useful to kind of. We don't get to read a lot about that relationship in Acts, but you can kind of interpret some things out of Philippians 1, because what the Philippians' first introduction to the church, to Christianity, is that the guy that taught him to them almost immediately gets thrown in jail and beaten. And I think that's an important point, because when you look at what he says in Philippians 1, for example, down in verse 12, he says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." Can you imagine the Philippians? He got here, and within probably 2 or 3 days, he's thrown in jail. He has to leave. We don't know if Paul ever went back to the Philippian church. He may very well have. But now they hear, well, he's in Rome, and sure enough, he's in prison again. And you start to wonder, well, is Paul ever going to, is this going to work out? Is he really going to be able to do what he wants to do? And so Paul writes this letter that very much is about his own persecution and his own ability and willingness to deal with those things and to go through those things and to suffer for the cause of Christ, because he really kind of becomes, I think, the model of suffering for what the Philippians are going to go through. He said, because he basically warns them, you're going to have to go through all this as well. If you go down to verse, fact 27 in chapter 1, he says, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Engage the same confidence that you saw I had." In other words, back when I was with you, you saw what happened to me there, and now hear that I still have. So you kind of get an echo a little bit of what he's been going through. And it's interesting, by if you go over to chapter 2, where Paul's talking about his own care for them and his own concern. And if you go down to verse 19 in chapter 2, he says, "I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare." Why would that be? Well, because Timothy was there at the beginning, wasn't he? He was with Paul when they first came into Philippi, when they first converted. He was one of the people that was instrumental in bringing these people to Christ. And so you kind of see that bond here. He says, there's no one I have who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. And I think what he means, I don't think he means that nobody else cares about you. I think he means that Timothy, more than anybody else, has reason to have this bond with you and have this affection to you. And so he says he does say in verse 21, they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ, which, by the way, just going back to what we talked about, John Mark, I expect Paul had a pretty high expectation of pretty much everybody. I mean, when he says, "I have no one like him," they all seek their own interests. I doubt the people with Paul were really just, selfish and not really interested in the gospel, but there's a level of devotion that Paul expected. Even when you think about in Second Timothy, where it says they've all forsaken me. He says specifically, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. And we don't know what we can suspect what that means. We don't know. But then he says Titus is gone, and a couple other people are gone. Now, again, have they gone for bad reasons, or have they gone because there was something more important than being with Paul? So he had pretty strong expectations of the people who were with him. But it says, it tells you a little bit about his regard for Timothy. He's the one that I trust to go to you and really care enough about you to do the work that needs to be done and do it in the right way. So you kind of see that allusion to the bond that he has developed with him, and then of course you see the allusions in chapter 4, or the references in chapter 4, to the fact that even though he was only with them for a short time, Philippi had continued to support him in the gospel. It says in verse 10, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Now that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have not that I was speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. He says in verse 15, and you Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. So, in other words, when he left Macedonia, apparently they were in contact with him to the point where they said, we want to continue to give you financial support after you've left this region. So they developed this bond with him. And it says, even in Thessalonica, in other words, even when I continued down the road later on, which we'll read about here in a little bit, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So they were offering him help uh, throughout his early years, apparently from the very beginning, and he continued to support him all throughout that time. So we don't read much about their interaction, but you can imagine, starting with someone like Lydia, who clearly was someone of resources, someone who had from the very beginning latched onto what Paul was saying and embraced the gospel. There was a lot of willingness and a lot of desire to support him in the work he was doing. And so we almost read none of that in the letter, in the work of Acts, but we can kind of learn some of the connections that were developed during that. I always think that's useful. So as we go down, after he leaves Philippi, and that is I'm sorry, yeah, back in Acts 16. And again, I'm spending more time because I know we don't have a whole lot of time to get through all this, and I was really more focusing on just the journey itself and some of the tie-ins and some of the connections we can make, because obviously we could talk all day about the Philippian jailer and some of the other stories that we're bringing up. But we see in chapter 17, as they leave Philippi, we now see them come down to Thessalonica. They come through Amphipolis and Apollonia. It says they come to Thessalonica. And again, we see this pattern in verse 2 where it says, Paul went in, and as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. I just think it's interesting the way Luke points that out, because I think obviously one of the big and maybe the biggest objections he's going to get from the Jewish people is, what do you mean the Messiah got killed on a cross? Why would that happen? Why would God do that? And so Paul's really, most of his argument is going to have to be, this is why it had to happen this way. I suspect in a lot of ways the things that eventually would become the book of Romans were probably discussed in great detail in some of these conversations. And it does say that he in verse 4, he did persuade a number of them to join Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. And this is what I was referring to earlier. It says in verse 5 that the Jews became jealous, and they create this mob, and it says they couldn't find Paul, but they do find Jason, who was apparently one of the men that was hosting and supporting them. And it says these men in verse 6 have turned the world upside down and have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another King Jesus. It's the same exact accusation that they were making back in Philippi. They're teaching people to violate the law. But the irony here is, in this case, who is it that's bringing them before the law? The Jews are. Okay, why would the Jews have an issue of worship? You think the Jews would be supporting somebody that's worshiping somebody other than Caesar? Because they're worshiping somebody other than Caesar. But it's the same behavior we saw right back in when Christ was killed. Because when Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king?" What was their response? No king but Caesar. We're all in on Caesar, which of course was a lie. They didn't worship Caesar. The Jews knew they didn't worship Caesar. But here they're going to completely ignore all that because we're going to bring Paul in and his, or at least try to bring Paul in. It says, and accuse them of subverting the Roman government by doing exactly the same thing that they themselves were doing. And it's again, as happens so often, it says in verse 8, the people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. It sounds like, again, the Romans really didn't know what was going on here. All these conversations were going on in the synagogue. And when it's brought to their attention, well, I don't really know anything about it. We'll just, you pay. Basically, what they did is tell Jason, you put down a deposit on these guys to make sure that they don't do anything. And it says immediately they headed down the road and went down to Berea from Thessalonica. And as we already talked about, the men who were more noble because they searched the scriptures, they didn't just immediately start uh, rebuking and gainsaying and just being contradictory. They actually studied this. But the problem comes again when the people from Thessalonica hear and they come down and begin stirring things up again. And so it says the brothers in verse 14 sent Paul off on his way to the sea. And it does say that Silas and Timothy remained there. We'll come to that in a minute. But Paul goes on to Athens, and he apparently he sent Silas and sent word by the brothers back to Silas and Timothy to come and to join him in Athens. So we have to do a little bit of deduction here, but we can kind of figure out, I think, what happens here because Paul is waiting in Athens, and of course, this is where he gives the great speech in Mars Hill. He gets to go before the Stoic, the great thinkers of the world at the Areopagus. This would have been, Athens at the time apparently was the cultural capital of the Roman Empire, and so who knows what kind of people were around Paul when he made this speech. But certainly some of the great philosophers of all time were listening to this. Not surprisingly, they didn't accept the gospel, but it would have been quite an audience. It's interesting. He's approached by these two groups, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And I don't know, are y'all familiar at all with them? Uh, mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sensuality, yeah, that kind of thing. It was basically, the Epicureans said, "You only live once. Once you die, you're worm. There's nothing else going on. You really need to pack in as much joy as you possibly can while you're on this life." The Stoics believed in uh, they they believed that there was some sort of eternal force, and I'm not sure. I'm sure it varied within that, but their idea was that it was about logic and reason, that we shouldn't be emotional and things like that. We shouldn't let emotions drive us. And so you've got really two extremes. And then Paul comes and preaches the gospel. And when you think about how each would respond to that, of course, the Epicureans who say there's nothing after death, well, you're saying Christ raised from the dead. No, that's ridiculous. When we die, we're dead. They're not going to accept that. And the Stoics, who are all about logic and the human thought process of reason, and they're going to hear this and go, well, exactly, how do you think I'm going to believe? How could I possibly believe that a man could rise from the dead? Even though they might believe in some sort of eternal concept, the idea that a man could just rise from the dead is that's not logical. And so clearly, neither one of these, so these two very opposite groups, but neither one of them is going to embrace what Paul has to say. And so as a result of that, it does say that he had a few people that did listen to him. It says in verse 34 of chapter 17, some men joined him, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. There were a few people. Now, we don't, it never says here in this passage that Timothy and Silas joined Paul in Athens, but we think that they did. Because later on we're going to read about this. We're going to read this referenced. I think it's in First Thessalonians. Let's look at some. Look over First Thessalonians chapter 3. And by the way, again, we see we're not told much about the Thessalonican visit, but we see the bond that Paul had developed with them as we read those letters, and we can kind of see In fact, maybe, who knows, maybe it's the philosophy of that day and the idea of the resurrection and dealing with the Stoic and the Epicurean objections that has him reminding them and encouraging them to wait for the coming of, both Thessalonian letters are very much about the second coming of Christ and what's going to happen during that time. And and again, he tells them the same thing as he said to the Philippians in a lot of ways in verse 6 of chapter 1. You became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction and with joy of the Holy Spirit. And you can imagine, this is the place where Paul gets here, and almost immediately, within 4 weeks, the Jews have chased him out. You can imagine how they dealt with the Christians that were still there, that had still believed. And he commends them, saying, they chased me out and I had to leave. You had to stay, but you remained faithful. And it says in verse 8, not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivered. And we learn a little bit about some of the other things that go on. In chapter 2, he talks about the fact that, it's interesting. Maybe this was before the Philippians started to support them, because if you'll notice, he talks about it down in verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you. We proclaimed you the gospel of God. And so they were working to earn a living while they were doing all this. And so maybe it's the Philippians haven't started supporting them at that point. But it's interesting. He talks about this bond and how concerned he was with them. It says in verse 17 of chapter 2, since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time. Again, that's one of those things where you look back and read the book of Acts and you say, oh, yeah, I get it. He was torn away from them. He was literally chased out of the city by the Jewish population. He wanted to stay longer. He says, for a short time in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. For what is our hope, our joy, our crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus that is coming? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, beginning in chapter 3, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind in Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith. So, in other words, at some point when they're in Athens, Paul and Silas get there and join Paul, which is what he had instructed them to do. And I suspect that Paul's asking how they're doing in in Thessalonica, and Timothy's saying they're having a hard time. The Jews are really persecuting them. They're really having a difficult time, and he wants to go back and encourage them, and he can't do it. He just doesn't have the opportunity. And finally, it says, I sent Timothy. So I suspect while he was at Athens, he sends Timothy back. I want you to go back and check on them and make sure everything is okay, and encourage them. Um, and it says that he comes back to report to them, which I believe, if I've got it in my notes, if I remember correctly, it would have likely been in Corinth when he wrote this book, wrote the book to the Thessalonians. So he's still on his second journey when he writes this book, which, by the way, depending on when Galatians is written, that probably makes First Thessalonians the first of the earliest of the epistles, depending on, again, when Galatians was written. But he says in verse 6, now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as we long to see you. For this reason, brothers, in all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you through your faith. For now we live if you are standing fast in the Lord. And so it's kind of again, it's interesting to see those tie-ins and that concern. It wasn't just Paul going from church to church and just, all right, next up, next up. The whole time that he's going through, he's leaving behind and thinking to himself, yeah, but I really needed to stay with them. They weren't ready. I needed to go. There's more that we could have done there. So when Paul talks about this, and I think is it Colossians, when he talks about first of all, my prayers and my concerns for all the churches, all these groups that he has worked with, that he continues to be emotionally invested in as he goes from place to place. And so we see that in the Thessalonians account as well. Let's see. What else did I want? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Switches back to they. which means, and I think, and I'm trying to remember where it was. I think Luke got left in, oh, I can't remember where it was. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, because Luke wasn't in prison. But then, to your point, in verse 40, it says that when out of prison, they encouraged them and departed. So most likely, Luke then stays in Philippi, and so he's kind of leaving people behind as he goes, which is, you be the best way to approach this. So yeah, that's where Luke is going to leave him again, and he's going to rejoin them back when they get to Troas, when they come back to go out through there, as I recall. I may be wrong on that. Let's see. I always write. I made a note in my Bible. Yeah, but it's not going to be a while. It's going to be at the end of the third journey that Luke comes back to them. So he's been staying in Macedonia this whole time, which makes sense. He's from Troas, so he's familiar with the area. And he's left. They leave him in Philippi. They find him again in Troas, so he's going to stay in this area. Which, if you believe that Theophilus is an actual person, there's a good chance that maybe that's where he was from and where he lived. And Luke is doing these things in large part for as part of that work. But let's see if there's anything else I want to. Oh, that's all from Thessalonica. So he goes to Athens, as we mentioned, and he goes on from Athens to Corinth, and that's, as we talked about, that's where he's going to meet Aquila and Priscilla, and he's gonna spend time with them. And it says in verse 5, if you'll notice down in Acts 18, that when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, in other words, this is Silas and Timothy coming back from Thessalonica, where Paul had asked him to go. This is when he's getting this report that he writes about in First Thessalonians, which is why most people think that this is probably where he wrote that book. And so it says that once they got back, it says he was now occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So now he's really, before he was tent making, now he can go full time and work. And we learned down in verse 11 that he stayed a year and 6 months in Corinth, which is, and it's kind of interesting. That's when you go back, and we're about out of time, so we won't go back and look at Corinth a lot, the letters of Corinthians a lot tonight. But maybe that helps us to understand some of the emotional content of First Corinthians and especially Second Corinthians, because it wasn't, he goes to Philippi for maybe a few days at most, and they develop this bond. And he goes to Thessalonica, and he's there for about 3 or 4 weeks, and they develop this bond. And he goes to Corinth, and he thinks he's developed this bond. But then he hears that all of a sudden it's not about me, it's really just about whoever comes and is impressive to you. The idea of I have Paul, I have Apollos and Cephas. You're picking factions. Later on, we learn that there's these other teachers that are coming in, some of whom are presenting themselves falsely. And Paul, in fact, Paul mockingly calls them super apostles at one point. These people who consider themselves to be much, much more important than me, and you've listened to them. And so you can imagine Paul thinking, I went through all this with you. I was there for almost 2 years with you, and now I've gone for a little while, and these people come in, and it's like I don't matter anymore. And so when you think about that in that regard, maybe it helps to understand when you read the Corinthian letters, some of the real pain that you can read Paul when he writes this book, because he invests a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of love in the Corinthian church, and of course they're his. I guess you want to call them call them his problem child. I guess you could probably say that they were. But despite all that, as we always say, we talk about the Corinthian church and how horrible it must have been, and yet Paul called them brothers, and Paul loved them, and Paul worked with them, and Paul worshipped with them, and did a lot of things for them. And so maybe there's a lesson there for us. Um, that's probably a good place to stop. We may talk a little bit more about Corinth next week. I forgot what we're gonna do. Um, I will try to get some things together and we can wrap this up. If I can't do it, I'm going to keep the singing in my back pocket, but I'll give it a shot. At least maybe we can have some. So let's try to get into the third journey, 18 down through 20. That's probably pretty good. Actually, down into verse 21, I guess. So, but so we'll spend some time talking about that next week. All right. Uh, got an invitation here. 347 is the song that we will sing. Please turn off our